Mm. So let's talk about classism as the not necessarily the basis of warfare, but a method by which warfare is enacted. So class and classism is an interesting sociological construct that sort of refers to the idea that there are strata, strata, in some societies um, that have differing responsibilities, rights, benefits, and privileges, as well as duties. Um, in the case of the feudal system, it was liege, lord, and serf. In the case of the Indian caste system, there's about three or four of them. So the most common ones people know of are Brahmin and Dalit. Um, in a caste system or a classes system, you might find things like segregation in some cases. So extreme forms of classism involve segregation practices or apartheid or apartheid. Classism also refers to um, the patriarchy, so the idea of there's a male class and a female class in a society. Classism also refers to the filial piety system of ancient China, and there's other examples around the world. A class system is distinct from a moiety system or a totemic system because in a moiety system, even though each individual has a responsibility, uh, usually to a totemic being, um, and the relationship between totemic beings is mirrored as relationships between the people as well. There is no definition of one moiety being of a higher or lower class than the other, or having more rights and responsibilities than the other. They just have different duties and different relationships, but their rights and responsibilities more generally are the same. Okay, except for on that those particular groups of matters. That seems to be what the difference is. In a classist society or a caste-based or apartheid style society, the rights of people are different. So um, and the responsibilities are also very different. So, in the feudal system, the liege lord had the right to own property, and the right to the best share of the produce. They had the right to consume particular types of produce that the serfs were not allowed to consume. So the serfs had sheep and goat, and barley and rye, but wheat and cow, um, milk in particular, or the land of milk and honey, was for the liege lord. It wasn't necessarily the case like that everywhere or all the time, but usually it was. Um, in the case of the filial piety system, the women are subordinate to the men and the younger men to the older men. So it is a patriarchy as well as a gerontarchy, which means older men. Um, and specifically, these relationships aren't just about delegation of responsibility or duty. It's also about authority and obedience. So this is a very important difference to make, is the idea of authority or obedience. Whilst there are societies with what they call elder councils or gerontarchies, they're not necessarily always ruled by an older person. They're ruled by um, people of good standing who are considered elders in their community, and they don't necessarily have more authority or rights than the other people. So it's not a necessarily rule by obedience. It is a rule by leadership, and depending on the social structures, by discipline, but not necessarily obedience. So in the societies that run moiety systems or elder council systems, they're not caste systems and they're not classist apartheid systems, because it's not ruled by obedience. Now, that's going to sound really strange because some of those societies have very strict elders, but the elders often probably are exercising family relationships, and it's not expected to be blind slave obedience. Now, this blind slave obedience mentality, this militaristic blind slave obedience mentality, is what's expected of women in the filial piety system. It's what was expected of the serf in the feudal system. It's what was expected of the Dalit in the caste system, and it's what was expected of the black person in South Africa in the apartheid system. And similarly in other places around the world where there has been apartheid type situation. So although these classification systems are all arbitrary one way or another, their function and their style varies considerably from society to society. And the ones that expect blind obedience and absolute authority are the ones that are most concerning. They're the ones that are associated with totalitarianism, associated with fascism, and associated with authoritarianism. So that authoritarian, totalitarian, and fascist way of doing things. So fascism is a branch of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. It's not all of it. It's just the one that they call the far right version of it. Okay. Um, so the classism, okay, of patriarchy is an interesting one. Patriarchy is an idea that since Hammurabi, basically, in ancient Babylon, so about 6,000 years ago, right about the archaeologists have detected that around 6,000 years ago in Babylon, there was some kind of cultural shift, and a decade named Hammurabi shows up, and he declares that certain types of people were property and certain types of people were slaves, and that women were always property and always slaves, but there were rules for transference of that property. And the rules for transfer of that property is the basis of the dowry and earth system that's still in practice in some places today. So it wasn't actually Canaan or the Jews or the Sumerians or the Akkadians that invented that. It was Hammurabi. And those groups have, including Assyrians and that, those people were traveling around, and some of those people did travel through Babylon. And during the time of Hammurabi, some of those groups got those ideas because the Babylonians were interacting quite a fair bit with the Egyptians, who were in turn interacting quite a fair bit with the other groups. And eventually, those other groups became the Roman Empire and ancient Greece and Macedon and Persia. So all those cultures were starting to develop around them. And Hammurabi was at this sort of point just before a lot of those groups were starting to develop their civilizations out of their tribal communities. And Babylon, being one of the earlier places to do so with Egypt, was in one of its. Technically, it was later on in Babylonian history, not early on. Hammurabi was by no means one of their first kings. He was much later on. So they've experienced some kind of cultural shift, and they've decided that that women were property to be exchanged between men, specifically from father to husband, using the dowry, what's now called the dowry and or earth system. Okay, that meant throughout Mesopotamia, the Middle East, North Africa, and as a consequence of events that followed, Europe, women were classified as property throughout the entirety of the Roman period onwards, right up until the 1870s in Britain. Okay, so one of the things that might be defined as a breaking point in the ending of that particular propertification of women was the 1873 common law ruling in the British Common Law Courts, which said that women were allowed to testify in court and not be and instead of having two men speak for her, because for a long time their court system was based on ecclesiastical law, which in turn was derived from a lot of different cultural movements and influences, and all of that goes back to Hammurabi. So, um, this idea of certain types of people being property or slaves of others um, appears to involve a cultural shift that happened around about then. It was also around about that time that you had Confucius or actually Confucius might have been later, but the Confucian filial piety system was developed after that. The Indian caste system was developed after that. So it's almost as though, and actually just double checking. Yes, filial piety and the caste system was invented after that. So that system of propertification of women seems to have its origins with Hammurabi, a Babylonian. Okay, this is several thousand years before the founding of the first Temple of Jerusalem. Okay, the first founding of the Temple of Jerusalem was a couple of thousand years after that. Okay, it was a really long time ago that these events occurred. Okay, Hammurabi was a long time ago. Okay, so this is about 6,000 years or something of propertification of women across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and the Middle East. Okay, some places more or less than others. Okay, because those empires, the European Empire, the Egyptian Empire, which was associated with Babylon. See, Babylon was to ancient Egypt what Greece was to Rome. It was its own independent country that was flourishing for its own reasons, independently of the other one, but they interacted quite heavily. You probably noticed that the major empire and the minor empire providing a lot of intellectual support for the major empire, being a featuring pattern of empire throughout the aeons or the eras. Babylon was to Egypt, what Greece was to Rome, what Canada is to the United States, and what New Zealand is to Australia. I mean, you have heard of Russell Crowe, Nicole Kidman, everyone know, and Eric Barnett. They're all Kiwis. Anyway, Hammurabi was a Babylonian. And the Jewish language, the Hebrew language, didn't develop until after the birth of Christ, what they call the Christian period. At this point, there's no evidence to support he ever existed, but we'll call it that time period so you know what it means. And though in that time period they spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew, so Hebrew is developed after that. The ancestors of those people existed though, okay? And the first temple of Jerusalem occurred after Hammurabi, okay? The people in question were moving to and from what's used to be called Samaria and Acadia, and through Assyria and northern Egypt and around Canaan and Judea, and they were moving about. Okay, if you read the Bible and the old stories, they're in tents and they're moving around. Okay, and they go in and out of Babylon a few times. Okay, and Babylon had Hammurabi. It's really interesting they never mentioned Hammurabi in the Bible. But there's archaeological evidence to support that man's existence and what he did, so it's a little bit strange. Anyway, just put that aside for a second. Classism, okay, existed before Hammurabi, though. So the propertification of people and the formalisation of saying some people are property and some people are not, and this is how they're exchanged, is an outgrowth structurally within empires of other forms of classism that came before. So classes did seem to develop maybe as a consequence of professionalization. So it's been suggested that professionalization and specialization meant that a priestly class develops and a pharaonic class develops, like a kingly class and a farmer and a labourer's class and whatever else, but that's not the same thing. The tradition of teaching a son what your trade was or your family trade was, because that's the skill you have to teach them, is not the same thing as a structured imperial social order with people with phalanxes and sharp swords and bows and arrows and these days tanks and bazookas, telling people that you have to do that because that's your family line, because that's your class, because you have to, otherwise you're going to get shot and taken to the dungeon. Okay, so this for a long time there was a forced lack of social mobility. So it wasn't always like that. Okay, maybe specialisation has happened first, and then that's developed into classism as some people got a bit psychopathic and sat on their thrones and thought they were better than everyone else and they could just take whatever they fucking like. And then when their Grand Vizier friends spun a few yarns at people and told them a bunch of mythological bullshit to prop up their establishment, and the enforcement of ripping people off became commonplace. And then, because they were getting away with it, the properification of people, maybe. Okay, and that's when you get Hammurabi. And so, a practice of taking members of... So if a war party went into a different territory and captured some people and took them to forced bonded labour for the invaders, that's technically slavery. That was practiced outside of Hammurabi. The actual formal legislation or legalization of a caste system of slavery and properification was Hammurabi. Okay, so that crime against women in that case began with Hammurabi. Okay, so there's a fair few languages and a fair few cultural systems that we have to work through before we get past the false sense of entitlement, the toxic entitlement syndrome, that's imprinted into the language groups and cultures associated with that to overcome that particular type of classism. Okay, and it's called gendered classism. Okay, it's not a natural feature of humanity, it's a cultural one. Okay, the culprit has a name, it was Hammurabi. Okay, it's a known thing. Okay, other types of classism, were propped up by that. Okay, so the women being the property of the men in that story, okay, would have been forced to raise people with certain types of values to keep society going, so they and their family don't get into trouble. And those values would, of course, been propaganda to create other types of classism to support the imperial structures. And in that case, you're going to get working class versus capital. Okay, in the modern language, it's labour versus capital. So when I put it that way, it's like, friendly Geordies, we can see what you're saying there. So, the enslavement of women was designed to create and maintain the labour versus capital divide. And capital in the olden days was the king or the pharaoh, and the propaganda machine was the Grand Vizier, the priestly class, and the priestly class later became the Vatican, and in some cases you had theocracies, so the king and the priestly class were the same, and much later on these days, your priestly class is your pulpit TV people, and your pulpit TV people sometimes are practicing what's called scientism, which is scientism, which needs to be distinguished from science proper, okay, because they're doing what you call pulpit science, okay, they're doing propaganda. And so text real is an example of propaganda. Okay, it's propaganda that covers up for something else. So, when the oracles at Delphi were sniffing the volcanic rocks, and they were talking in parables about the aristocracy of Greece by using terms like Zeus or whoever else. So they were sitting there and they were saying, Zeus is a gross man. Oh, he's so yuck. Oh, I have a vision about Zeus. Okay. They were talking in parables about the aristocracy to talk about them indirectly. They had different stories for different people that came through. So a member of the Greek aristocracy visited them. They would say other characters. And they were of course engaging in propaganda. Okay, they weren't just simply getting psychic visions and advising people what they saw in a diligent and honest manner. Sometimes they were pretending to have psychic visions and delivering propaganda in a manipulative manner, because if they were the one that everyone was coming to for advice, then they knew what the story was better than any of the other characters. So they were twisting it. And the grand viziers were the same, and the priests were the same. When people went to confession, they were the same. Okay, and that was the purpose of it. That was the purpose of it. So even though there was a time when there was people who actually believed that stuff, okay, because of the manipulative thing and the propaganda thing, okay, the purpose of that is to control people with stories, okay, and that's what this YouTube shit's for. That's what the TV's for. That's what the newspaper's for. And those stories are to keep Labour from respecting one another and going after capital. And they're also to keep people from seeing that they don't have to damage each other with the filial piety, with the Dalit Brahma divide, with the women as property crap. Okay, it's propaganda to cover their asses, because those characters, okay, they're not all from the same families, but some people like to argue that sometimes, not all the time, because there is a social mobility thing during the Industrial Revolution with the merchant class that emerged, okay? So not all of them came from the aristocracies, okay? Some of them didn't, okay? But the upward socially mobile types have extra to prove so they can get their money, okay? So maybe some of those people, okay, did a bit of ass kissing, and some of them did a bit of ass whooping. But whatever the case might be, okay, whatever the case might be, you're going to find that those that were raised with the toxic entitlement mentality, such as apartheid South Africa, is a very clear example in modern USA politics, are probably going to have trouble checking their prejudice. Okay? They might have classist attitude. Okay? Not just racist or sexist, but classist. And they might not be aware of their classist attitude. They might not know that's what it is. They might think operant conditioning level, that they're being rewarded for their behaviour, so why could it be bad? Okay? So, the aristocratic mentality, the billionaires club mindset, okay, is not the same as the plebeian. Now, the plebeian knows that. Okay, the plebeian is in the majority. There is more labor than there is capital. In labor, the people, the plebeian, the serf, knows that. They can see Billionaires Club once and go, that guy's full of it. Okay? But they don't, because they don't necessarily have that mindset, they don't necessarily see just how much toxicity that mindset has. They also don't see just how much toxicity the plebeian mindset has. Both have toxicity. Over the course of the generations, okay, that Billionaires Club mindset programmed those people to think they're not bad billionaire if they do a bit of philanthropy. We'll give $1 million over there, okay? So we'll spend $100 million on this project that bombs a village, but we'll give $100 million to that project over there for Habitat for Humanity, $1 million over there. They're doing philanthropy, see? They're good. They've got a philanthropical foundation and charity here, $100 million. Over there, they've just spent $100 million blowing something up, okay? So they think that they can take a big chunk with one hand and give a crumb with the other, and it makes it better. Okay, this type of mentality, okay, is they play the propaganda game. Look over here, he gives $1 million. He's a nice one. He's got noblesse oblige. He's got philanthropy. Okay, and this one, but that one didn't look at him as over. He's okay, look, that's the same game they've been playing for a long time. Okay, that's the same game. Okay, that sub news story. Okay, that propaganda. Okay, it's an old tactic. It's not a new one. Okay, so if you're looking at things like text reel or whatever, what you're looking at is a basically 1300s worldview with a 23rd century technology idea. Okay? Albert Einstein once said, you've got to be wary of people, technological advancement outpacing their moral development. He was worried that the technology was faster than the empathy and the wisdom and the compassion required to wield it safely and with respect and in trustworthiness. And as usual, Mr. Einstein sounds like the smartest guy. Okay? We can't help it. Mr. Einstein wasn't dumb. Okay? Right? But anyhow, okay? But you can't have labor hate capital and capital hate labor. You need to understand that the capital hates labor, just the same as labor hates capital. And there are people from both groups who concede the humanity on both sides. Okay? The ones that hate you more than anyone else is military. Okay? Military is trained to hate you because they're trained to have every aspect of their goodness taken from them so they can exercise their duties. They are trained for absolute obedience to authority. And they are definitely running a classes system right there. A structured hierarchy from general to private, or ensign and admiral, or whatever it might be. And so, the ultimate form of sexism is using someone else
to describe these things because you know that's how it's meant to be. A woman's body has a particular job, and her job is to waste her time dealing with other people's nonsense, woefully misguided and represented by busybodies who don't know what they're talking about, because those individuals have military programming. Okay? So, without further ado, okay, what you'll probably find is that the Brotherhood of the military hates women. Okay, when they're on the battlefield and the two armies fight each other and they hate each other then. But in both cases they hate women. In 2006 the United Nations did its first prosecution of rape as a war crime. Okay, capturing the women and raping them as an act of humiliation. Do you know why they made homosexuality illegal in so many societies? It's because in the ancient villages, the gay men used to dress up as the women when the marauders were coming and cop it while the women ran away. It's unsurprising, isn't it? There's a natural affinity between women and gay men. They've been each other's strongest allies. And gay men got given a bad name. They got called scum because the warlike straight men, when they went to maraud the village, didn't have women to rape. They had a grown man's butthole. Okay? You wonder why God was against gays? Westboro Baptist Church? Is because he didn't want soldiers to be faggots. And he was from an opposing kingdom, sitting on a throne, stealing your lunch money. Maybe soldiers should be fags. Maybe the entire military was gay. We'd have less wars.